The sun was barely up in New York City, but the energy inside the studio of Morning Talk Live was already buzzing. David Leavitt, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp mind and bold opinions, adjusted his tie as he prepared for another day on live television. The show had been running for years, and it wasn't just popular, it was iconic. Every morning, millions of people tuned in to hear what Leavitt and his team had to say about the world's biggest stories. Today's topic? Global leadership. It seemed like an ordinary choice until things took a surprising turn. As the cameras rolled and the host introduced the panel of experts sitting alongside Leavitt, the conversation started off predictably enough. They talked about presidents, prime ministers, and even tech moguls reshaping industries. But then, almost out of nowhere, Leavitt shifted gears. "Let's talk about someone who might not be on everyone's radar yet," he said, leaning forward.
Slightly. His tone was casual, but there was a spark in his eyes that caught the attention of everyone in the room and at home. Pope Robert Prevost. The name hung in the air for a moment. Even the other guests seemed taken aback.
Sure, Pope Robert Prevost had recently become the head of the Catholic Church, but he wasn't exactly a household name outside religious circles. Not yet, anyway. Most people only knew bits and pieces about him, that he came from humble beginnings, that he'd spent years working as a missionary in Latin America, and that his election had raised eyebrows because of how unconventional his background was. Leavitt paused, giving himself time to gather his thoughts, or maybe just to let the
audience catch up.
Then he continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "There's something different about this Pope, something intriguing. He's not your typical Vatican leader, if you know what I mean." You could practically feel the curiosity ripple through the studio. One of the panelists, a historian specializing in religion, nodded slowly. Another guest, a political analyst, raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure where Leavitt was going with this. And viewers at home? Well, they were hooked. Social media feeds began lighting up with questions. Who is Pope Robert Prevost? Why is David Leavitt talking about him now? What does he know that we don't? Leavitt didn't rush to answer those unspoken questions right away. Instead, he painted a picture, a vivid one. "Think about it," he said, gesturing with his hands as if trying to bring the idea to life. This guy didn't come from the usual path. He wasn't groomed for the papacy like so many others before him. No, he was out there, boots on the ground, working with some of the poorest communities in the world. That kind of experience shapes you. It changes the way you see things. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that Leavitt wasn't just making idle observations.
There was passion in his voice, a sense that he genuinely believed this pope was worth paying attention to. Maybe it was the way Prevost carried himself during public appearances, quietly confident, yet approachable. Or maybe it was the whispers
coming out of Rome, hints that he might be planning to shake things up in ways no one expected. Whatever it was, Leavitt's words struck a chord. By the time the segment ended, people weren't just curious, they were intrigued. Conversations spilled over into living rooms, offices, and online forums. Was Pope Robert Prevost really as revolutionary as Leavitt made him sound? And if so, what did that mean for the future of the Catholic Church, and maybe even the world? Little did anyone know this was just the beginning. The moment David Leavitt mentioned Pope Robert Prevost, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like the room was holding its breath. Leavitt leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful,
but deliberate. He glanced at the panelist beside him and then directly into the camera, as if he were speaking to every single viewer at home. "You know," he began, his voice steady but tinged with intrigue. "There's something about Pope Prevost that feels different, almost revolutionary." The word revolutionary lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. Then, without warning, Leavitt dropped a bombshell. "I've heard whispers, rumors really, that this pope isn't just following tradition. He's actively working behind the scenes to change some of the church's oldest rules." The studio went silent for a split second. Even the host, who was usually quick to jump in with follow-up questions, seemed stunned. One of the panelists, a scholar of religious history, cleared their throat nervously. Another guest, A political analyst sat up straighter, clearly intrigued,
but unsure how to respond. Leavitt didn't stop there. He pressed on, his tone measured but charged with energy. Think about it. We're talking about secret meetings with leaders from other faiths, people the Vatican might not have even considered sitting down with before. And then there are the rumors about LGBTQ+ rights. Some say Pope Prevost is quietly pushing for a more inclusive stance, one that could redefine how the Church interacts with the modern world. By now, the tension in the room was palpable. The historian on the panel finally spoke up, shaking their head firmly.
These are just rumors, David. Unverified claims. To suggest otherwise is irresponsible. Their tone was firm, almost defensive, but Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded respectfully, acknowledging the critique while maintaining his position. I understand the skepticism, he replied smoothly.
But let's be honest. When has the Vatican ever been completely transparent? If anything, these whispers should make us ask questions. Shouldn't we want to know what's really going on? The debate unfolded rapidly after that. The political
analyst chimed in, offering a more balanced perspective. Look, I'm not saying these rumors are true, they said cautiously. But if even half of them are accurate, it could signal a massive shift, not just for Catholics, but for global
religion as a whole. Backstage, the production team scrambled to keep up. Fact-checkers furiously typed away, trying to verify Leavitt's claims, or at least find evidence to support or refute them. Social media exploded almost instantly. Hashtags like Pope Prevost and modern church reform began trending worldwide. People were divided. Some praised Leavitt for bringing attention to what they saw as long overdue changes. Others accused him of spreading falsehoods and disrespecting the church. One tweet stood out among the chaos. Whatever you think of Leavitt, he just made everyone talk about the Vatican again. Love him or hate him, the man knows how to spark a conversation. That sentiment echoed across platforms, capturing the essence of the moment. Meanwhile, Leavitt sat calmly in his chair, watching the reactions unfold in real time on a monitor off camera. He knew he'd struck a nerve, and he couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. This wasn't the first time he'd stirred controversy, but something about this story felt bigger, more significant. It wasn't just about politics or entertainment. It was about faith, identity, and the struggle between tradition and progress. As the segment wrapped up, the host thanked the panelists and moved on to lighter topics, but the damage, or perhaps the breakthrough, had already
been done. Viewers couldn't stop talking about it. Debates raged online, in offices, and around dinner tables.
Was Pope Robert Prevost truly planning to overhaul centuries-old doctrines? Or was this all just speculation fueled by Leavitt's knack for stirring the pot? For Leavitt, the aftermath only deepened his resolve. He knew he had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed anytime soon. Over the next few days, he dove headfirst into research, determined to uncover the truth. He scoured news articles, interviewed former clergy members, and reached out to sources embedded within the Vatican
itself.
Each new piece of information added layers to the story, painting a picture of a pope caught between two worlds: the ancient traditions of the Church and the demands of a rapidly changing society. What started as a casual remark during a live interview had spiraled into something far greater. Whether it would lead to answers or more questions remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: Leavitt had ignited a firestorm that showed no signs of burning out anytime soon. The morning after the interview, David Leavitt woke up to a storm. Not the kind that rages outside your window, but the kind that brews online and spreads faster than wildfire. His comments about Pope Robert Prevost had gone viral, and not everyone was happy about it. Social media feeds were flooded with reactions, some praising him for shining a light on what they believed was an overdue conversation, while others accused him of spreading lies and disrespecting one of the oldest institutions in the world. Leavitt scrolled through his phone as he sipped his coffee, taking it all in. He wasn't surprised by the backlash. Controversy came with the territory of being a journalist who didn't shy away from tough topics. But this time felt different. This wasn't just about politics or entertainment, it was about faith, tradition, and identity. People weren't just debating his words, they were questioning their own beliefs. The Vatican didn't stay silent for long. By midday, a brief
statement appeared on the official website, urging caution against unfounded rumors about the Holy Father's intentions. The message was polite but firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Still, it only added fuel to the fire.
Critics latched onto the statement as proof that Leavitt was stirring unnecessary trouble, while supporters argued that the Vatican's response was vague enough to raise even more questions. Things escalated further when a high-ranking cardinal held a press conference later that week.
Standing before a crowd of reporters, the cardinal dismissed Leavitt's claims outright, calling them dangerous fabrications. His tone was stern, almost angry, and his words carried weight. For many devout Catholics, this was the validation.
They needed to side against Leavitt, but for others it only deepened their curiosity. If the claims were truly baseless, why did the church seem so defensive? Back at the studio, Leavitt found himself caught in the middle of a whirlwind. Calls poured in from viewers, colleagues, and even a few anonymous sources claiming to have insider information. Some praised him for having the courage to ask hard questions, while others demanded retractions or apologies. The pressure mounted, but Leavitt remained calm. Years in journalism had taught him how to handle criticism and how to use it to dig deeper. He spent the next few days buried in research,
poring over documents, transcripts, and interviews.
Every lead mattered, no matter how small. One afternoon, he stumbled upon an article from a little-known Catholic publication that mentioned Pope Prevost's early days as a missionary in Latin America. It described his work among impoverished communities, his advocacy for social justice, and his willingness to challenge authority when he believed it was necessary. The more Leavitt read, the more convinced he became that there was truth behind the whispers. But finding evidence wasn't
easy.
The Vatican operated under layers of secrecy, and those closest to the Pope weren't eager to talk. Leavitt reached out to former clergy members, academics, and anyone else who might offer insight. Most declined to comment, citing fear of repercussions or a lack of knowledge. A few, however, agreed to speak, off the record. Their stories painted a complex picture of Pope Prevost, a man deeply committed to his faith, but equally determined to address the Church's shortcomings. One source, a retired priest who had known Prevost years ago, shared a memory that stuck with Leavitt. He once told me, the priest recalled, that the Church can't survive unless it learns to adapt. He said, "Tradition is important, but so is relevance." Back then, I thought he was just speaking philosophically. Now I wonder if
he meant something more. As the days turned into weeks, the story continued to evolve. Leavitt's initial comments had sparked debates not just about Pope Prevost, but about the role of religion in modern society.
People began asking bigger questions. Should the Church change to reflect the times, or should it hold fast to its traditions? Who gets to decide what stays and what goes? And most importantly, does reform mean losing the essence of faith or strengthening it? For Leavitt, the experience was both exhilarating and exhausting. On one hand, he knew he'd struck a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. On the other, he couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility that came with wielding
such influence. Every word he said, every claim he made carried consequences, not just for him but for millions of people around the world. Despite the challenges, Leavitt refused to back down.
He believed in the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable, even when it meant facing criticism. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. By the end of the third week, the fallout showed no signs of slowing. Protesters gathered outside St. Peter's Square, holding signs that ranged from "Reform Now" to "Respect Tradition." News outlets covered the protests extensively, amplifying the divide between those who supported change and those who resisted it. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, tensions simmered. Rumors swirled about internal disagreements among cardinals and bishops, each faction vying for control over the direction of the Church. Through it all, Leavitt kept digging, driven by a mix of curiosity and determination.
He knew the truth wouldn't come easily, but he also knew it was worth pursuing. What started as a simple mention during a live interview had grown into something much larger, a global conversation about faith, power, and the future of one of the world's most influential institutions. And as he sat in his office late one night, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing screens, Leavitt allowed himself a small smile. Controversial or not, he'd done exactly what he set out to spark a dialogue. Whether it led to answers or more questions, only time would tell. Just when David Leavitt thought the story couldn't get any more complicated, life threw him a curveball. It came in the form of an unexpected phone call, one that would change everything. The caller didn't introduce themselves right away. Instead, they simply said, "You've stirred quite the hornet's nest, haven't you?" The voice was calm but carried a hint of humor, as if the speaker knew something Leavitt didn't. Leavitt leaned back in his chair, curiosity piqued. "Who is this?" he asked cautiously. The response was measured. "Let's just say I've been following your work closely, and I think you might be onto something." It turned out to be a nun, someone who had served alongside Pope Robert Prevost during his years as a missionary in Latin America. She explained that she'd watched the interview and read the articles swirling around it. While she didn't agree with everything Leavitt had said, she believed the conversation he'd sparked was important. More importantly, she wanted to share her perspective, not because she supported or opposed him, but because she felt the truth deserved to come out. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of the city. When Leavitt arrived, he spotted her immediately. She wore simple clothes, her demeanor humble yet confident. There was a warmth about her, a sense of purpose that made it clear she wasn't there for attention or fame. They sat down, ordered Coffee, and began talking. "I want to make one thing clear," she said after introducing herself. "I'm not here to confirm or deny anything, but I do think context matters. People hear words like reform and assume the worst, or the best. The reality is much more nuanced." Over the next hour, she painted a vivid picture of Pope
Prevost, not as a distant religious leader but as a person. She spoke of his tireless dedication to helping marginalized communities, often working late into the night to ensure no one was left behind. She described his ability to listen without judgment, to see the humanity in everyone he met, and she shared stories of how he challenged authority figures within the church, pushing for greater compassion and inclusion, even when it cost him politically. He wasn't afraid to ask hard questions, she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, but he also understood the weight of tradition. You don't survive in the Vatican by ignoring it, you navigate it. That's what makes him so fascinating.
He respects the past, but he's not afraid to imagine a different future. Leavitt listened intently, scribbling notes in his notebook. Her insights added depth to the portrait he'd been piecing together, humanizing a figure who had become almost mythic in public discourse. For the first time, he saw Pope Prevost not as a symbol of controversy, but as someone grappling with the same struggles many people face, balancing ideals with reality, tradition with progress. But the nun didn't sugarcoat things either. She
acknowledged the resistance Prevost faced from conservative factions within the church, describing heated debates and power plays that unfolded behind closed doors. Change doesn't come easily, she admitted, especially in an institution as old as ours. Some people see reform as a threat, while others view it as salvation. It's messy, and it's painful, but it's also necessary. As their conversation drew to a close, Leavitt thanked her for her honesty. Before leaving, she gave him one final piece of advice.
"Be careful," she warned gently. "Not everyone will appreciate what you're doing. But don't let fear stop you from asking the right questions. The world needs people like you, people willing to seek the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, back."
At his desk later that day, Leavitt couldn't stop thinking about their meeting. What struck him most wasn't just the information she'd shared. It was her courage. Here was someone embedded in the very heart of the institution under scrutiny, risking her reputation to shed light on a complex issue. It reminded him why he became a journalist in the first place, to give a voice to those seeking meaningful change. With her permission, Leavitt decided to include parts of their conversation in his ongoing investigation. To protect her identity, he referred to her only as a source close to the Pope. Her words provided a counterpoint to the polarizing narrative dominating headlines, forcing readers to consider the human side of the story. Meanwhile, the public debate raged on. Protesters continued to gather outside St. Peter's Square, their signs reflecting the growing divide. Inside the Vatican, whispers of internal conflict grew louder. Some cardinals reportedly praised Prevost's vision, while others pushed back, fiercely, warning of the dangers of moving too quickly or too far. Leavitt found himself at the center of it all, fielding calls from viewers, colleagues, and even critics. Some accused him of bias, while others hailed him as a champion of transparency. Through it all, he remained focused on one goal: uncovering the truth. He knew the story was bigger than him, bigger than any single person. It was about faith, identity, and the struggle to find common ground in a rapidly changing world. By the end of the week, Leavitt realized something important. This wasn't just a story about Pope Robert Prevost. It was a story about humanity itself, about our desire to hold on to what we value while embracing the need to grow, about the tension between preserving the past and building a better future, and about the courage it takes to ask difficult questions, even when the answers are uncertain. As he stared at his computer screen late one night, drafting his next article, Leavitt allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it. After all, some stories aren't meant to have neat endings. They're meant to spark conversations that last long after the headlines fade. Weeks had passed since David Leavitt first mentioned Pope Robert Prevost on live television, and the world still couldn't stop talking about it. What started as a casual comment during an interview had snowballed into something far bigger, a global conversation that refused to die down. People were divided, passionate, and more engaged than ever. But just when everyone thought they'd heard everything, new developments began to surface, pushing the story into uncharted territory. It all started with leaked documents. No one knew who released them or how they ended up online. But once they were out, there was no turning back. The files contained drafts of proposals, some written in Latin, others in English, that appeared to confirm some of the rumors Leavitt had hinted at weeks earlier. Among them was a suggestion to allow married priests in certain regions where clergy shortages were severe. Another document outlined plans for greater dialogue between the Vatican and other faiths, including Islam and Judaism. There were even whispers of steps being taken to address historical injustices committed by the Church over centuries. The internet exploded almost instantly. News outlets scrambled to verify the authenticity of the leaks, while social media lit up with reactions. Some hailed the documents as proof that Pope Prevost was indeed a reformer, someone willing to take bold steps to modernize the Church. Others dismissed the leaks as fabrications, accusing enemies of the Vatican of trying to undermine its authority. Amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: these revelations had changed the game entirely. For Leavitt, the leaks were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they validated much of what he'd been saying all along. On the other, they intensified the scrutiny he faced.
Critics accused him of orchestrating the leak himself, though he denied any involvement. "I'm a journalist," he said firmly during a follow-up interview. "My job is to report the news, not create it. If anything, this proves the importance of asking tough questions."
The Vatican's response came swiftly and cautiously. A spokesperson issued a brief statement, neither confirming nor denying the authenticity of the documents. Instead, they urged caution, reminding the public that leaked materials often lack context and can be misleading. It was a diplomatic move designed to buy time while the Church figured out its next steps. But for many, it only fueled suspicions that the leaks were real, and that the Vatican was scrambling to contain the fallout. Amidst the growing tension, Pope Robert Prevost finally broke his silence. In a rare televised address, he spoke directly
to Catholics around the world. His tone was calm but resolute, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that made people listen. He didn't address the specific claims in the leaked documents, but he didn't need to.
Instead, he focused on broader themes of unity, humility, and the challenges of leading an ancient institution through modern times. Change is never easy, he said, his voice steady and measured. It requires courage, patience, and above all, trust. Trust in God, yes, but also trust in each other. We must remember that we are not called to preserve traditions for their own sake, but to serve humanity with love and compassion. His words resonated deeply with many viewers. For some, it was exactly what they needed to hear. A reminder that progress doesn't have to mean abandoning faith. For others, it raised more questions than answers. Was Prevost acknowledging the reforms? Was he preparing the faithful for changes ahead? Or was he simply buying time until the storm passed? Leavitt watched the speech from his office, leaning forward in his chair as if trying to absorb every word. When it ended, he sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled through social media, reading reactions from people across the globe. Some praised Prevost's eloquence and vision, while others remained skeptical, accusing him of dodging the issue altogether. What struck Leavitt most, however, was the sheer diversity of responses. People weren't just debating the Pope. They were reflecting on their own beliefs, values, and hopes for the future. A young woman in Brazil tweeted, "If the church can change, maybe there's hope for the rest of us too." An elderly man in Italy wrote, "We must protect our traditions at all costs. They define who we are." Even atheists joined the conversation, sharing thoughts on the role of religion in society. For Leavitt, this was the turning point, the moment when the story transcended headlines and became something deeper. It wasn't just about Pope Prevost anymore. It was about humanity's collective struggle to balance tradition with progress, faith with reason, certainty with uncertainty. And as a journalist, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just another scoop. It was a chance to hold up a mirror to society and ask hard questions about who we are and where we're going. Over the next few days, Leavitt threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He reached out to experts in theology, sociology, and history, seeking their perspectives on the implications of the leaks. He interviewed ordinary people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, about how the controversy had impacted their views on religion and leadership. Each conversation added layers to the story, painting a richer, more nuanced picture of the challenges facing not just the church, but the world. One interview stood out in particular. It was with a retired teacher who had grown up Catholic but drifted away from the church over the years. "I stopped believing in the institution a long time ago," she admitted. "But hearing the Pope talk about trust and compassion, it reminded me why I believed in the first place. Maybe it's not about perfection. It's about effort, about trying to do better, even when it's hard." Her words stayed with Leavitt long after the interview ended. They echoed what so many others were saying, regardless of their stance on the controversy, that the real challenge wasn't finding answers, it was staying open to the questions. That's what made this story so compelling. It wasn't just about one man or one institution.
It was about all of us grappling with the same fundamental issues. As the week drew to a close, Leavitt found himself reflecting on the journey so far. He had started with a simple remark during a live interview, unsure of where it might lead. Now, months later, he was at the center of a global reckoning, one that touched on faith, identity, and the human desire for meaning in an ever-changing world. He knew the story wasn't over.
In fact, it might never truly end. But for now, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, he had done his part, not just as a journalist, but as a storyteller. He had sparked a conversation that mattered, one that would continue long after the headlines faded. And in a world filled with noise, sometimes that's the most important thing you can do. Months had passed since David Leavitt first mentioned Pope Robert Prevost during that fateful live interview. But the ripple effects of his words continued to shape conversations worldwide. What started as a simple remark had evolved into something far greater, a movement that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, tradition, and progress. For Leavitt, the journey was both exhausting and exhilarating. He had faced criticism, praise, and everything in between, but now,
as he sat at his desk late one evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment.
This wasn't just another story. It was a chapter in humanity's ongoing quest for understanding. The controversy surrounding Pope Prevost showed no signs of fading. If anything, it grew more complex with each passing day. Some viewed him as a visionary leader willing to challenge centuries-old norms, while others saw him as a threat to the very foundations of the Catholic Church. The leaked documents, authentic or not, had ignited debates that transcended religion, touching on universal themes like power, identity, and change. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their thoughts on social media, at dinner, tables, and in places of worship. It seemed everyone had an opinion, and for Leavitt that was exactly what he had hoped to achieve. As the dust began to settle, Leavitt decided to take a step back and reflect on everything that had happened. He pored over notes, transcripts, and recordings from interviews he'd conducted over the past several months. Each piece of information told a part of the story, but when pieced together, they painted a larger picture, one of resilience, courage, and the human spirit's relentless pursuit of growth. Inspired by what he had uncovered, Leavitt made a decision. He would write a book, titled Faith and Fracture, Inside the Rise of Pope Robert Prevost. The book became an instant bestseller. Readers praised its balanced approach, thoughtful analysis, and ability to humanize a figure who had been reduced to headlines and hashtags. Leavitt didn't shy away from addressing the controversies. He tackled them head-on, but he also made sure to highlight the humanity behind the headlines. Through anecdotes, expert insights, and personal reflections, he reminded readers that this wasn't just a story about a pope.
It was a story about people trying to navigate a rapidly changing world. In the final chapter of the book, Leavitt shared his own reflections on the experience. When I first mentioned Pope Prevost during that interview, he wrote, I had no idea where it would lead. All I knew was that there was something intriguing about him, something worth exploring further.
What I didn't realize was how much this story would teach me, not just about the Vatican, but about ourselves. He went on to explain how the controversy had revealed deep divisions within society, but also moments of unity and hope. People often ask me if I think Pope Prevost will succeed in implementing the changes he's rumored to be pursuing. My answer is always the same. It doesn't matter. What matters is the conversation he's sparked, the questions he's forced us to ask about who we are and what we value. Change isn't easy, especially when it involves something as deeply rooted as faith.
But avoiding those hard conversations only delays the inevitable. Leavitt's words resonated with readers around the world. Many saw themselves in his reflections, recognizing their own struggles to balance tradition with progress. A retired
priest wrote to thank him for shining a light on the complexities of leadership within the church. A young activist said the book inspired her to keep pushing for reform, even when faced with resistance. And a skeptic admitted that while he still disagreed with many of the ideas discussed, he appreciated the effort to foster dialogue rather than division. For Leavitt, the success of the book wasn't just about sales or accolades. It was validation that he had done his job well. Journalism, at its core, is about telling stories that matter, and this one had mattered deeply. It had challenged assumptions, sparked debates, and brought people together, even if only to disagree respectfully. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came months after the book's release, when Leavitt received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, the kind of note that felt rare in an age dominated by emails and texts. The sender identified themselves only as a friend of the church, someone who had followed the story closely from the beginning.
They thanked Leavitt for his dedication to uncovering the truth, acknowledging that while not everyone agreed with his methods, his intentions were noble. The world needs more people like you, the letter concluded. People willing to ask
hard questions even when the answers aren't clear. Thank you for reminding us that faith isn't static. It's alive, evolving, and messy, just like the rest of us. Reading those words, Leavitt felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent
years chasing stories, but few had ever touched him as deeply as this one.
It wasn't just about Pope Prevost or the Vatican. It was about the connections we make, the conversations we have, and the lessons we learn along the way. Looking back, Leavitt realized that the true impact of his work wasn't measured in
clicks, views, or book sales. It was measured in the lives it touched, the minds it opened, and the hearts it moved. Whether people agreed with him or not, they couldn't deny that he had sparked something important, a global reckoning that
transcended borders, beliefs, and backgrounds. And so, as he closed his laptop for the night, Leavitt allowed himself a quiet smile. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be new challenges, new controversies, and new stories to tell. But for now, he was content knowing that he had played a small part in shaping a conversation that mattered. Because sometimes, the smallest mention can have the biggest impact. And in a world filled with noise, that's the most powerful thing of all.